Okay, so my name is Austin, and this is my next video in the series on why I love the novel Infinite Jest. And starting with this video, and I would guess for at least two or three more, I am going to be talking about the Boston AA meeting that is described in great detail starting on page 343, right, where they start. I mean, they essentially, each speaker, it goes through their sharing and sort of breaks down elements of it while also interjecting, you know, general truths about Boston AA and also, you know, elements of Gately's own sobriety through the first, little over a year that he's been sober. Um, and yeah, I mean, this book sort of consistently not just talks about AA, but Boston AA specifically, which, I've never attended a meeting, so I'm not speaking to the accuracy of that. But overall, whether or not it perfectly matches what happens in reality, I think this section still has an incredible amount of value. And yeah, like I said, I would guess that I'm going to spend at least 3 videos discussing this. But in this first one, what I want to talk about is an idea that's presented, very early in the section, which is the difference between identifying and comparing. So, within the book, identifying is essentially just described as being completely empathetic with another human being, and doing everything you can to see yourself in them, right? Identifying parts of yourself in that person's story. Whereas comparing is to focus on the differences and to allow those differences to, give you the opportunity to lie to yourself. And so, specifically, within this section, the difference between identifying and comparing is the example is given through a series of, when you are a person in AA and you are listening to somebody's story as they're sharing sort of their bottom or falling off point or whatever you want to call it, what elements are you focusing on in their story? And, there's a part where Gately's talking about how he was doing early on in sobriety and in his earliest AA meetings, where, he would sit there and listen to people and be like, oh, well, I never did that. I never did that. I never did these things. And how this is sort of a very default position to fall into, where you're just focusing on the differences. The problem with this is that you can, use this to lie to yourself, right? If a person who's sitting in an AA meeting is listening to another person's story and they hear them talk about how, like, on their third DUI, they ended up, getting in a car wreck and seriously injuring someone, then a person can sit there and be like, oh, well, I never even drove drunk, so I don't have that problem at all. And if I didn't do that, then that means my situation isn't all that bad yet. See, there's so much worse that you can get than where I am now, so therefore, I don't have a problem. But, just because the exact details of your story and that person's don't line up doesn't mean you don't have a problem, right? They may have gotten into a wreck while you didn't, but at the same time, you might have gotten divorced and lost custody of your kids while that person never went through that. So, if you play the comparison game, then it just gives you this incredible ability to lie to yourself about your situation. Whereas if you focus on the similarities between you and this person, if you try to identify, you can realize that the exact details of your bottoming out story are never going to be the same, right? The details will never be the same, but the overall narrative is, right? It doesn't really matter what sort of tragedies or losses or what happened to let you get to a point where you bottomed out. It doesn't matter how you got there. What matters is that you're there. And when, especially like someone who's newer in sobriety is sitting there in the meeting, they have the opportunity to think that way and to just realize that, even if the details aren't the same, this person has gone through the exact same bottoming out experience that I have. And that maybe because they've already been through this and have stuck around a little bit longer than I have, there is something that I can learn here. But ultimately, I think one of the main values of identifying instead of comparing, right? One of the main values in looking for the similarities between you and another person instead of the differences is about, gaining the ability to forgive oneself, right? Because if you focus on the differences, if you sit there with the mentality of, I never got a DUI, I never got into a car wreck and hurt someone, then you can allow yourself to avoid having to accept any of the realities of your situation and who you are and what you are. Whereas if you have the ability to sit there and focus on the similarities with anybody that's up there speaking, you can start to realize how much not only you and this person have in common, but how much everyone here has in common. And you can start to see that all of these bottoming out stories, they are a feature of everyone in an AA meeting being human. And, no matter how bad what they did is, no matter how bad it seems, it is something that is part of the human experience. And if you can start to listen to these people and you can focus on the similarities, then you can start to see the humanity in them. And if you can start to see the humanity in them, then you can realize that having any kind of expectation that a person is going to go through their life without making any mistakes is unrealistic. And if you can start to realize that you cannot expect perfection out of any human being, then maybe you can start to expect that from yourself. That you can understand that while the mistakes that you've made aren't okay, it's okay to make mistakes. And that if you can sort of open the door to being able to forgive yourself, then maybe you can start being honest with yourself. Because if you can't forgive yourself, then you can't be honest. You have to live in denial of your life, right? If you say that certain things are unacceptable and you know that you've done those things, then you have to do anything you can to avoid accepting that reality. And comparing yourself to other people is a fantastic way to do that. But if you can come to accept that you make mistakes because you're human, and that becomes even slightly acceptable to you, that if you just start opening the door to being able to forgive yourself, then you can begin to be honest with yourself. Because you can be honest with yourself without hating yourself. And I think this is a critical idea that this book covers. And I think it does it in a really fantastic way, right? Obviously, it discusses it explicitly within this AA meeting that I'm reading, which is why I'm bringing it up now. But there are, many implicit examples throughout the rest of the book with different characters and, how they may or may not have learned the difference between identifying and comparing, and therefore may or may not have learned the difference between being able to forgive themselves and not, and therefore may or may not have learned how to be honest with themselves. And yeah, I don't know. I think this is incredible. And, it's the first part of the AA meeting that I'm going to discuss, but, I think there's going to be at least 2 more videos, if not a few more than that. But anyways, that's all I have.